Hi, I'm Steve Tuecke. I am Deputy Director of the Computation Institute here at University of Chicago and Argonne National Laboratory. I've been around here for a long time. Ian and I've been working together for about 20 years now, and historically my job has been architect, lead developer, manager of the Globus project, Globus group. Spent a few years out in industry and returned here about 2 years ago to again join Ian and continue to drive our projects forward. So more recently I've been leading the Globus Online efforts and continuing Globus Toolkit, as well as working with some of the science communities that we work with around those projects.
Okay. Back when you got involved initially with the Globus project, you were responsible, I think, for lots of different elements. You were the architect, the developer, the designer. So, are those essentially the same roles for you? Have you kind of backed off a little bit and let the community take over?
No, actually, in many ways, it's even expanded more. You can think about having sort of two halves to me. One of them is the whole group reports to me, so I'm responsible for all of the hiring and managing of our team. We have 30 plus people at this point, staff working on our team, and so something I spent a lot of time on the last couple of years, for example, is really rebuilding our team. Got in a whole new group of really great programmers to supplement some of the team we had, have rebuilt some of the management team. So part of it is just making sure we have a really first-class professional organization and bringing in the right processes, agile development models, these sorts of things on the sort of management side. And then on the other side, it's more the architecture technical front, right? So I still am kind of lead architect, lead technical person on Globus Toolkit and Globus Online. So all the development activities and architecture activities there report up into me. So I'm continuing to do that. I'd say one difference between, for example, now versus 10 years ago when we were doing this is the team's matured a lot. Some of the people who at that time were sort of young, fresh out of school kids, including I wasn't too far out myself, have matured and grown up in the system. So I really have managed at this point got a team that is so much more functional, so much more capable of delivering, including without always me having to do it. So it's it's really fantastic. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Ian and I have been talking for the last year or two about this, what's the pithy response to grid versus cloud? And the best we've come up with so far is grid equals federation versus cloud is really equal to hosting, right? So they're a little different aspects of the puzzle. But even if you go back to the early 2000s when we were working really closely with IBM, IBM had their whole program was their e-business on demand program, and in today's term, there was a lot of that was about cloud, right? It was about how do you provide on-demand resources to solve problems for your customers in these distributed environments. And so grid has always had these various aspects from the kind of hosting side of things like we call cloud now, to the more distributed computing, federated security, federated resource side. So it's always been there. What's happened over the last 5 years in particular, though, is that cloud side has finally really come to fruition, right? For a whole variety of reasons, technological, sociological, business models, everything have finally come together for that aspect of things to come out. And so, we're delighted to see that, because that's a whole big part of the problem space that we've been involved in a long time and have wanted to see to come to fruition. We like to think we maybe influenced some of the directions in our grid work that led to cloud, but going forward, there's still a role for both of these, right? There's still the need for cloud computing, right? We're using cloud software as a service techniques in Globus Online, hosted on cloud infrastructure as a service, Amazon, for the hosting for all the same reasons all the other companies use Amazon. But we're using that for more traditional grid problems, if you will, which is how do you allow users to get access to a broad class of resources across all the different providers in the U.S. cyber infrastructure community. And so it's a blending of these two concepts. And so far it seems to be working pretty nicely.
Where do you think cloud succeeded then, where grid might have I don't mean to say failed, because it never failed, but cloud has really taken off. I mean, commercially, like, I was watching MSNBC yesterday, and there was a Cisco commercial talking about cloud. They were talking about cloud computing on the actual newscast. I mean, where was the disconnect, do you think?
Yeah, so I often laugh when I see these commercials, because I remember many of the same commercials that use grid, and I remember when Sun decided to pepper grid into all their marketing on sort of everything they were doing, right? So part of it is there's a little bit of deja vu here. But that said, I mean, there's something very real to cloud, which is, the concepts, of course, have been around for decades, long before we ever called some of these things grid, right? They were called other things. But, what's happened in the cloud space as much as anything is, and like a lot of things in technology, it's a confluence of events that cause something to finally kind of pop, right? And in cloud, that confluence includes the technology, large-scale cluster-based server farms, which of course a lot of those techniques spun out of the original HPC community and cluster communities and grid communities. The business models, the likes of Amazon, having the foresight, being bold enough to come along and really take a leap with the pay-as-you-go type business models and build the systems necessary to support that. I remember 10 years ago with the IBM e-business on demands, they had these notions, but it would take you 2 weeks or a month to get your system provisioned, not stick in a credit card, get something back in minutes, right? Sociological, right? You had the likes of Salesforce.com come along and really drive into the common practice the use of web-based resources as the basis of delivering of your applications running in cloud infrastructures, right? So a lot of things happened that sort of finally came together for that particular part of the problem space to pop, right? But that's only one part of the problem space, right? So, grid, that part of grid, if we don't worry about the names, there's still the other part for the science communities of, again, how do you access the various computing facilities and get your data from your instruments to your computing resources and back to your back to be visualized on your machines, and how do you manage your collaborations, and right, all these problems are still there. So, I guess we could say, I guess that some of the original, those aspects of grid have moved on and be given a different moniker, which is all fine, since a lot of our stuff was just a different moniker for things that came before us as well. So it's all good. It's been very interesting with Globus Online. With Globus Toolkit, it was always this low-level infrastructure software. It's always very hard to demo, and it's never very sexy, right? It's this sort of low-level stuff. And with Globus Online, it's the first time really that our group has directly taken on responsibility for writing software that end users are touching directly, using, that's affecting them. And it's been a really interesting experience, sort of eating our own dog food, right? Seeing how Globus Toolkit works, and in some cases doesn't work, and improving it, and trying to figure out what do the end users kind of need directly, and not relying on some of these external parties to do that. So it's been, you'll see tomorrow in my talk when I do the demos of it, it's really fun actually having end user software to demo, and the responses we're getting. I don't know if you've seen some of the Twitter feeds of the oh my god, I've installed it in 5 minutes and it's made my life so much easier. Right? We didn't tend to get those from Globus Toolkit because we were so far removed in many cases from our users. Yeah, the installation piece was a bit of a mess for most people. Yes. Well, and particularly the security piece, right? And that was always a really tough part of Globus. And it's still under there now, but one of the advantages of, for example, even the Globus Online approach is because we have the end-to-end problem, this gives us opportunities to address the security in end-to-end ways. It just makes it so much easier, right? So, Stu Martin, one of the longtime Globus people here, and who runs one of my dev teams now, comment about how it took us a while to get used to the software as a service model, to understand we're operating a service for the community. But once we kind of settled into that, we realized it offered a whole lot of possibilities that the toolkit never did, right? There's solutions to problem that when you're running a service are so different than when all you can do is throw some software over a wall to somebody else to use. So that's really helped us a lot on addressing some of these challenges going forward. I'd say in many ways we are. The environment has evolved, of course, and the nature of the problems and the solutions to them have evolved. But the Distributed Systems Lab was set up basically at the same time as Ian and Carl and I hatched Globus as an idea. So they kind of always went hand in hand, Globus with Distributed Systems Lab. So can really sort of ask sort of the same question about Globus, right? Of when we created Globus, what were the problems we were trying to solve, and how do they relate to the problems we're addressing now, right? And the end user problems in some sense are the same, right? It's still about scientists who want to get their science done and need better capabilities from the systems, from the IT, the ways that they manage their data and run their jobs and deal with the security off sites, right? All those sorts of issues are still there and still part of what we do, and the end motivator is still the same. Of course, what's evolved has been the technological ecosystem that we have at our disposal to address those problems, right? In '95, when we went into this, the internet was still pretty new and browsers were still pretty young, and right, the notions of software as a service to first order didn't exist, and cloud computing, well, there was, I guess, things like application service providers and things like that in the late '90s, right? Cloud as it exists today wasn't around, right? So we have a whole lot more capabilities in our arsenal that we can bring to bear, but fundamentally it goes back to trying to solve science problems via distributed infrastructure, and that's what we're continuing to do, and gradually getting closer and closer to solutions to the problem.
So theoretically, anyway, I mean, you guys are using a completely scalable resource. You're using Amazon to back your software as a service. If you have the infrastructure side of the puzzle kind of solved, what on the software side, the software as a service side, hasn't been addressed fully yet? What is the big challenge there?
Well, if you look back actually even to our original Anatomy of the Grid paper, remember that was published late '90s, around then, we always talked about these layers. At the bottom you have the fabric of the base computers, you have the connectivity, the IP networks and the security layers. Then you have the resource layer, which was all about how do you take a resource and expose it out, put it on the grid so that other things can make use of it and users can access it. And then we talked about the connectivity layer, which would talk about how do you knit together sets of resources end to end and on up to applications. And one of the things in Globus is Globus Toolkit, we kind of got stuck at the resource layer, right? We never, we worked with a lot of other communities to build custom systems for addressing the end-to-end connectivity layer or collective layer type things, right? The end-to-end solutions for high-energy physics or gravitational observatories or climate communities. But we ourselves in Globus didn't build too much of that sort of higher-level software that really addressed the end-to-end solution. And so that's really what we're doing now with the software as a service. So much of the same lower level stuff, the plumbing is there and is the same, and it's evolving, right? Again, you got new technologies, like the new security methods, identity providers, all the modern web security that factors in. We have to make all this stuff still sort of integrate in. But fundamentally what's new for us is moving up the stack to the more end-to-end solutions and trying to generalize those and make those broadly available. So that's our new bit.